Okay, so Dylan Cummings here for Rollt.Magazin, here with Mike Sheen and Lee Fawcett from RGK. Mike Sheen is the General Manager at RGK and Lee is the sales team leader. As well as that, Lee is also a two-time Paralympian, once with wheelchair basketball and once with fencing. And he's also the head coach of RGK Tees Valley Titans, a British wheelchair basketball Premier League club. Guys, thank you for joining me today. How are you both? Mike, I'll start with you.
Yeah, very good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, mate. And Lee, what about yourself? How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. Yeah, looking forward. Always good to see you, Dylan.
Cheers, mate. I really appreciate it. And we'll just crack on. So, Mike, I'll direct the first question to you. As a company, how do you feel about the current situation, and why do you feel this way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's heartbreaking, more so for the athletes than anything else. And we sympathise massively with those guys. I guess the reason why we're I guess emotionally connected to it is because we work with a lot of people. It's in our business. You can clearly see that, like, the IPC are trying to do the right thing on some level, but they've kind of just got it wrong, and the timing even more so. So that's why we're kind of feeling the way we do right now.
Yeah, and Lee, have you got anything to add to that?
No, just same with Mike. I know it's a difficult job what IPC are trying to do, and I can understand what they're trying to do, but I cannot certainly understand from the disappointed athlete's point of view also.
Yeah, definitely. And this brings me on to my next question. Lee, I'll start with you this time. As a company, why have you supported this political message, even though the ruling as of right now does not directly affect RGK-sponsored athletes?
I think, like how Mike said, the wheelchair basketball family is a family. It's part of the world in terms of the business of the chair suppliers. Going right down to the players, to the staff, to the coaches. Everyone is in it together when it comes to that. So I think from a company point of view, we've seen plenty of these players. We've been to events, where we've been there to support, the sport as well as our RGK ambassadors. But we have a good connection with everyone on the field.
And Mike, have you got anything to elaborate on that point?
Yeah, I mean, we normally don't really take any kind of political stance. As a business, we have to be very neutral. But this one's a bit closer to our hearts. Not just having wheelchair users within our business, but ambassadors. Just because it doesn't affect them doesn't mean it doesn't affect the people they play with and our customers at the end of the day. We spend a lot of time trying to get people involved in sport and creating leagues, and this just puts a few more barriers in there, which is disappointing, really.
Yep, and this leads me on to my next question. As a company, why do you feel it's important that other companies also get on board and show their support to the athletes?
Yeah, at the end of the day, all the companies that are involved in this space, in this industry, we've all got the same intentions, right? We might be rivals, we might be competitors, but bottom line, we're there for the same reason, is to support people and give them the best equipment for them to do whatever they want to do, really. Companies can only really show support. We can't do that much. It's really down to the athletes to drive it, but we're going to support our athletes, that's for sure.
And Lee, have you got anything to add to that?
No, just echo what Mike says on that. I think all the companies are probably feeling the same way. Some are affected by it a bit more, because it's maybe their ambassadors that are directly connected with it. But I think we're all feeling the same way about the rulings.
Yeah, definitely. And Lee, obviously, you acquired your disability. I believe it was 15 years old. So my next question is more directly relatable to you. Is obviously disability is a very subjective thing. For example, what you may see as a disability may not be the case as what some organisations see as a disability, as is the case with the IPC. So, in your opinion, do you think disability is subjective?
The thing is for me, if you're disabled and you've got any impairment, you're disabled. I remember being back at school many years ago when it first happened to me, and I remember the bad side of it when I was disabled, and my PE staff, the PE staff at school weren't designed or ready to do any sort of sport with a disabled person, and I remember while my friends did PE, I was in a classroom, doing homework. So that's what my PE lesson was. So I do feel, we have to be sort of fully open to ideas of it. And, if anyone has got an impairment, there's got to be a place for them to compete in sport, definitely, 100%. And now if that's not able-bodied sport, there has to be disability sport. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and Mike, what's your feelings towards the subjectiveness of disability?
Yeah, I mean, it's very subjective, isn't it? Everyone's unique. People can have exactly the same disability on paper, but in terms of function and ability, it can be quite different. So, yeah, of course, it's very subjective. But actually, that's what the sport classification is all about. When you talk about whether you can play or not, and is the ultimate physical disability subjective, well, it's only subjective when it comes very, very close to being an AB, which is what we're seeing now. So there is always an element of subjective, but as Lee said, you have to, if you're physically impaired, which should be your yes or no answer, you should be allowed to compete, in disabled sport. I guess the challenge is how do you test for that, which is really the line that we're on right now, that's for sure.
Yeah, and this leads me on to my next question. Is that the Ipc Classification Code has been, obviously, the Paralympics is a multi-sport event. So the Ipc Classification Code has been agreed upon by over 200 Paralympic sports governing bodies. Why do you think the code has been so universally agreed upon by these several different sports? Mike, I'll start with you and then I'll go to Lee.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know that much about the different sports in here. I guess the only experience I have is tennis, who have been affected by this with Alfie, who's one of our ambassadors, who's been effectively had the same sort of treatment compared to the basketball guys and girls. So I think it's a difficult one for me, because ultimately people want to stay within the Paralympics, and if that's what they've been told to do, then who are they to necessarily say, I don't want to be a part of that and I'm going to get out of it? I mean, I think Paralympics means a lot to a lot of sports, and maybe it's easier in some sports or not. I'm not really sure, if I'm honest.
Yeah, and obviously Lee is a former athlete. What are your thoughts on this? Why do you think the code has been agreed upon by other sports?
Well, for me, wheelchair basketball is quite unique. So if you look across the Paralympic sports, classification systems, athletics, I'll take athletics for instance, they have classifications within every sort of different grading. So, paraplegics would compete against paraplegics, cerebral palsy against cerebral palsy, higher end amputees, maybe it's against amputees. And then, wheelchair rugby, for instance, if you've not got a hand function impairment, me as a paraplegic, I can't compete in wheelchair rugby, for instance, at that level. But if you look at wheelchair basketball, you've got amputees, you've got minimal disabilities, you've got cerebral palsy, you've got spina bifida, you've got polio, you've got paraplegics, you've got quadriplegics, all competing against each other. That's why it's so universal, different to different sports. There's not many other sports where, fencing, that was two different categories. So there was a category A for paraplegics up to a certain level of break on the stomach, and then there would be category A, which is more for your amputees and stuff like that. So it's a really difficult one, and maybe in most of the sports that doesn't come into play, because they'd have to stay within that system. But wheelchair basketball is so unique in terms of their classification system, where there's so many disabilities that compete against each other. I'm up against an amputee player or a minimal disability, and I've got to defend them, and I've got to try and keep them out that key as a 1-point player. But a quadriplegic could be a 1-point player if they were in the basketball spot. So yeah, it's a difficult one, but I think that's the thing about wheelchair basketball. I'd say that's the difference.
Yeah, like you say, it's so unique. Like there's not many other sports where a wide range of disabilities are working together and competing against each other. So I suppose that's what makes it so unique. So which in turn makes it slightly harder to classify or fit into that mold of the code, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
This leads me on to my next question, just going back to the subjectiveness of disability. So we could argue that disability should not be split into 10 subjective categories. However, there is no denying that the IPC code covers a wide range, although not all, of disabilities. In your opinion, why should a wider range of disabilities/impairments be considered to be added to the code? Lee, I'll start with you.
I think we've mentioned it before. You know, there's got to be a place for every sort of impairment, and I watched Phil Pratt's sort of thing, and he summed it up really well. As where do you put them? You know, if there's nowhere for them to compete in able-bodied, and then they can't compete for their country in disability sport, where do they go? You know, where's the dreams? You know, some of these athletes have trained since they were 10-year-old to be where they are today. Just because you have a minimal disability, that doesn't automatically mean you're going to be a Paralympian. You've got to train and work hard for that. It's just not a gimme, you know. So I think that's the thing. There's got to be a place for everyone, and that's fully inclusive.
And Mike, what are your thoughts on the on why a wider range of disabilities should be added to the code?
Yeah, you know, you need rules, right? You need classifications, you need guidelines, but you want it to be getting bigger, not smaller. So we should be then saying, you know, more people can join that sport with maybe even smaller disabilities, rather than bringing it in to say, well, actually, no, it's only for a certain amount of disability. It should be getting wider. That's what I think.
Yeah, and Lee, you brought up an interesting point earlier, you know, sort of like what Phil brought up the other day as well, and Joey Johnson as well, is sort of like, where do these athletes that are classified as minimally disabled, where do they go? Like, for example, Annabelle Lindsay, who's been outclassed, she's already suffered an able-bodied career-ending injury, and now she's been told that she's non-eligible to compete in disability sport. So that's two crushing, she's been told two crushing bits of news in a short space of time. So it's almost like that, like, where do they go?
I mean, this is the thing about Annabelle. She came out and said wheelchair basketball saved her. You know, it saved that crushing thing. What a great thing for us, what a great promotion for the sport, that, you know, this sport saved a young lady from a career-ending injury, picked her up off the floor, she got in the chair, and then she was able to start and think of new dreams. And all of a sudden, that's just been absolutely snatched away from her. And that's what we've got to sort of consider here. There has to be a place for these people.
Yeah, definitely. And this brings me on to my next question. So there's no denying that certain health conditions can lead to permanent physical impairments. The example I'll use for this is George Bates. Now, to my understanding, George Bates was classified under Iwbs rules not because of his CRPS, but because of the muscle wastage that it caused. It's very much a specific case-by-case basis, right? Because other health conditions may not affect people in the way it's affected, say, for example, George. So with that being said, in your opinion, why should the IPC at least take into consideration the health conditions that can cause permanent physical impairments?
Is that to me or Lee?
Sorry, that was directed to Lee to begin with. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've got to consider. I mean, I've got a young man at my club who's, you know, we've had since the age of 6, and exactly the same sort of situation as George. You know, same very, very similar disability, and yeah, the kid's so energetic, and he can probably run around a little bit, and but not compete to any level of any able-bodied sport. And now we've had him to 6. Kid's 12 now, and, you know, he's going to be something special in a wheelchair basketball chair. And you're thinking, you know, what am I going to have to do now to have a conversation with that young man that, if, you know, he's been training now to try and get to this level, very similar to George did, probably after his football injury. And it's just a difficult thing, you know, they've got to take in these health conditions into consideration. Certainly do, you know, because it crushes dreams if you know they've worked up to a certain point and then they can't sort of compete.
Yeah, and I think that's where the majority of the wheelchair basketball community would agree with you. Mike, what are your thoughts on the situation?
Yeah, you know, it's there's always an exception to the rule, that's for sure. But I think if you ask the community, like you just said, you know, what do you want? Do you want more people playing? Do you want more disabilities playing? Then everyone would agree. But also it's about the end result of that inclusion. So, you know, people's stories, you know, people living those dreams, people just getting on with their lives. You know, even if you have an injury in later life or a condition, you know, I'm sure that can be absolutely heart-wrenching. But if you find something that gives you that motivation or that ambition to do something, that can change people's lives. And you know, Lee and the boys who sell for us, you know, they see that on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, that's bigger than normal sport. You know, Paralympic sport it serves a wider purpose. It's not just a career, it's life-changing, for sure.
I mean, just to add to that, Dylan, I mean, after the London Paralympics, what was the slogan was, you know, inspire a generation. Now, how many of these minimal disability youngsters came out with their woodworks after that games that inspired them? How many of them was sat at home and thinking, you know, there's nothing I can do, and then they watched that on TV and thought, wow, I want a piece of that. And then all of a sudden, this is the generation that's coming through. Now it has to be told, sorry, you don't qualify.
Yeah, it is that generation as well. It's those ones who are watching 2012 and said, I want to do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and just bringing back to what you said earlier, Lee, well, obviously as a journalist, I can't publicly give my opinion on this situation, but what I will say is this, is like, I've always thought that you're one of the best junior development coaches in the UK. Like, I've seen the juniors at your club, and Tina Gordon is also great at junior development as well. But like, I can imagine, like, say, for example, a new kid coming to your club, and then you're having to have a conversation with them saying, oh, you can play up to this level, you can't play at Paralympics. And I can just imagine the disappointment on that kid's face, you know. There's nothing to stop them just turning around and just going back home, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's like, I think this is where the issue lies with the IPC, is that they're, like in the case of George Bates, they're acknowledging that he has this health condition, but because CRPS isn't legally and lawfully listed as a disability, it's uncategorizable in their eyes. I don't know if that's the right word, but
yeah.
Anyway, so this brings me on to my next question. So, one of your ambassadors, Patrick Henderson, released a video on Wheelchair Basketball Canada that says, I believe the quote in it is, "We are all equal when we sit in a chair." However, some would argue that this does not apply to people that are registered blind or those who are solely missing an upper limb. As of right now, these people cannot get classified under Iwbs rules. Some would say this is a form of discrimination. What would you say in response to this? Lee, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I can see sort of a point on that, and any impairment is a disability. You know, there's people with visual impairments, but this is the thing within the Paralympics, you know, the visual impairment category sports, you know, they do not probably allow someone who's just got a physical disability within their sport as well. So it crosses over a little bit. I think if you've got an impairment, you've got an impairment. There should be some sort of classification there somewhere, you know, and I do always believe it. I've always said it about learning difficulty people. They don't have a physical impairment, but they have an impairment, you know, so it might be a neurological impairment where they won't be able to probably compete fully in a full blasted able-bodied sport. So, I mean, that's it opens up a whole new sort of questions and stuff like that on where we go in classification. If we're talking just about physical impairments, then, you know, we're talking, you know, they're the ones that's sort of got to be looked at.
Yeah, and Mike, what's your opinion on this situation?
Yeah, I mean, from Pat's perspective, talking about those within wheelchair basketball, which is, quite a good statement for me, because especially, if you put an AB on a chair compared to someone like Terry or Pat or Phil, it doesn't compare. It's a level playing field, but there is that next level of disability who are excluded now, who, to your point, should we be looking at a wider net of disabilities to enter wheelchair basketball to get participation up and to, be more inclusive? Absolutely, yes. And, that's where I'd want to see the IPC going, in terms of saying, we've got a new classification, we've extended it to get more people in.
Yeah.
How they do that, all right, that's not for me to say, but, those opportunities for people with, not just physical, but even, different disabilities that isn't that commonly acknowledged, or even that doesn't exist in sport too much. Why can't there be an opportunity for them? You see Invictus do a fantastic job of saying, well, don't worry about the rules. We'll just get all those people and play wheelchair rugby. It doesn't matter if you're an amputee or what, or if you're, very able. You get in there and have some fun, and there's a competition, there's a place for those people. Doesn't have to be Paralympics, but there's got to be a place for it. And that's the start of those movements, which then say, well, one day maybe it is a Paralympic, consideration. And those people who have worked to build those dreams get an opportunity to get a medal, right? Because that's what people dream of, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Like we mentioned before, the Paralympics is seen as the pinnacle for disability sport. Lee, this wasn't initially one of my questions, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, so sorry about this, mate, but you mentioned about potentially having people with learning difficulties fall under an Iwbs classification. But some would argue that the Special Olympics is for people with learning difficulties, and that should be separate from the Paralympics. What would you say in response to this?
Yeah, I think it just goes back to what Mike said there. It didn't necessarily have to be the Paralympics, but it needs to be a place where this can be fully inclusive, and I know them guys are they have the Special Olympics, and within sort of classification rules within IWBF, things can be sort of looked at that way, and it depends on what we want. We can't. I would rather invite more disabilities in rather than close the door on disabilities. That's the thing. I haven't got the answer. I have thoughts on it, but that's for other people to decide how they want to sort of do that. But certainly the answer is not to close the door on disabilities.
And it's interesting that you say that, because this brings me on to my next question. Obviously, we've touched on it, that wheelchair basketball is a very inclusive sport, if not the most inclusive sport in the world. Lee, I know yourself has been very passionate about stuff like inclusion. And Mike, of course, yourself as well. And now this potentially brings it away from the subject at hand, but I don't know if you saw my interview with Joey Johnson. He brought up quite a controversial point about opening up the Paralympics to able-bodied people and letting them compete alongside people with minimal disabilities. However, if this was the case, then the wheelchair basketball would lose Paralympics its place as a Paralympic sport, and in turn we would lose funding. So how would you feel about this if wheelchair basketball lost its funding? Lee, I'll start with you to begin with, obviously because you're a former Paralympian.
It's a difficult one. My son, he plays wheelchair basketball. He's able-bodied. He loves it. He trains hard. He sees it as one of his main sports, and he'd love to go and, for instance, play in Spain. He's so envious of the likes of George Bates and Phil Pratt, and love to play with them guys in the team over there. But that lad can also go and play football on a Saturday and run around and compete and have the chance of, if he's good enough, playing for, dare I say, Middlesbrough FC, one day, which is the point. And but the way we're going and the way all the sports are going, the pinnacle used to always be the Paralympics, and probably still is for most sports. But if you look at it now, tennis, Paralympics is big, but them guys still, they compete at Grand Slams, and You know, you look at rugby league next year, they're going to have a competition where the wheelchair, the able-bodied, the women's, everything's there. Wheelchair fencing, they compete at the big world championships where all the able-bodied one is. You know, so my fear, we've done so much with the Paralympics to get it so high that these sports start to outgrow the Paralympics a little bit. I hope that never happens. I really, really do, because, you know, being to two of them, it's an unbelievable experience. But the problem is these sports are sort of growing really fast, and they want to let people in and have it inclusive and build the brand of the sport. Before it was just a Paralympic sport. Now these sports have got identities. And this is the thing, if they keep on growing big, you know, the Paralympics, I hope not, might be like how football is for the Olympics. You know, you don't see the professional footballers really bothered about the Olympics. Tennis players, you know, they're not really bothered about fully getting that gold medal. They want to win Wimbledon. They want to win the US Open. And this is where disability sports growing. Paralympics is to thank for that, because they've built that platform. These sports are starting to get really big identities now. Look at how much wheelchair basketball was on the BBC Sports app last year. You know, so it's really growing fast.
Yeah, and you bring up some interesting points there, Lee, for sure. Mike, how do you feel about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point, and one I've had a few conversations with various people over the years on it. You know, because I think the Paralympics is really, really special. You know, it goes beyond, you know, individual players of sport. It's a whole movement. What it's done for disabilities and people's lives, and, you know, since it was created, is unbelievable. So I think you've got to respect that to a point. But, you know, Lee's probably made the main point there, is that, you know, the Paralympics is one aspect of an athlete's life. And yes, it is that 4-year cycle that you really work towards. But every year, you know, you've got domestic leagues, you then every couple of years you've got Europeans, World Cups, whatever that may be. And, you know, what I would like to see is the change, not in the Paralympics, but in those areas first. You know, Lee's got an AB playing in his club, that's great. You know, does that get bigger and bigger? Do, you know, ultimately over a long period of time, I don't know how long that is, you know, we do let more people in. But that's the way it should be going. Whether it takes 1 year or 20 years to do that, it's really difficult to say. But is it going in the right direction? Well, I would say from the club level, it probably is, because I think a lot of clubs want numbers, they want participation. So the clubs are going in the right direction, but then the Paralympics is going the other direction. So yeah, it's a very difficult one, but bottom line is we want more people playing the sport. Yeah, as simple as that.
Yeah, definitely. The more people we get playing the sport at any level, the more the sport grows, for sure. Now, you both touched on how the wheelchair basketball could potentially outgrow the Paralympics. However, we've mentioned this before, but the Paralympics is seen as the pinnacle of disability sport right now. So, with that being said, if we were to, I don't know, open up the sport to ABs at the highest level, and the Paralympics would wheelchair basketball would be out of the Paralympics. Obviously, the Paralympics would lose a lot by losing wheelchair basketball, because it's the biggest team sport at the Paralympics. However, they would just continue on, because there's several other different sports in the Paralympics. But do you think wheelchair basketball would be the same without the Paralympic Games? Michael, start with you on this.
Yeah, I mean, that was an easy one, because if you allow ABs in there and it's AB, then why can't it be in the Olympics, right? You get thrown out the Paralympics, you join the Olympics. If it's all inclusive and ABs can join, then maybe that's the way forward. Yeah,
Lee, do you feel the same way?
Well, yeah. I mean, the Paralympics has to be the Paralympics. It's as simple as that. Well, the Paralympics would have a massive hole if wheelchair basketball wasn't be a part of it. And I do feel that, you know, IPC and IWBF, they've got to get something sorted. IWBF I respect, you know, because they're ruling of, you know, they want to still continue with their classification system, and then maybe, you know, maybe they have to do another one to abide by the IPC. But, you know, surely they can sort something out where they can address this, where they can, you know, have that classification system as one. Both of them do not want to lose the other. That's my big point on it. They really don't. But I think wheelchair basketball is growing really fast, like any of the other sports. So it wouldn't be dead in the water, put it that way.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned that you respect the IWBF for protecting their classification philosophy, and I think a lot of athletes, coaches, former players, former athletes agree with you on that. But what's your opinion on the IWBF's handling of the situation?
I think they're in a no-win situation because they don't want to change their classification, which is all designed about being fully inclusive. But they also don't want to. They owe it to the sport and the athletes who, you know, eligible still can compete in that Paralympic game. So they had to make a deal. They couldn't sort of, you know, just go, okay, then no, we're stubborn, we're going to stick to what it is, and then be thrown out. You know, they had to sort of try and do something. But they're trying to, you know, get it the other way so they can stick to their policies by obviously keeping their classification but changing for IPC. Whether that's right, I don't agree, you know, but something's got to be sorted out, definitely.
Yeah. And Mike, what's your opinion on the IWBF's handling of the situation?
Yeah, you know, I think, as Lee said, they've been backed into a corner, and it's a very difficult situation to manage because, you know, you're trying to protect your sport and your athletes, but at the same time, you've got this pinnacle event that you really want to be a part of. So it's a no-win situation. There's no doubt about that, and they fought it. I guess the downside to that is all that fighting has then pushed the time into a really, really horrendous position, you know, close to Paralympics. So that's the only thing that you'd say, look, all right, it's a tough situation, but at the same time, you can't make those decisions so close to a Paralympics for somebody. You know, it's got to be done afterwards, surely.
Yeah, and just following on from that question, I found out recently the other day that the ITF, the International Tennis Federation, their athletes that have been deemed non-eligible, they came to an agreement with the ITF came to an agreement with the IPC to allow their non-eligible players to compete in Tokyo, and for their eligibility to run out after Tokyo. However, this is not the case for wheelchair basketball. What's your opinion on the agreements between the ITF and the IPC and IWBF and the IPC? Michael, start.
Yeah, man. I don't know how like who gets to make that decision, but for me, it's got to be consistent. You know, that's obviously affected Alfie Hewitt, who, you know, got told quite some time ago that he wasn't eligible, but he always was allowed to compete at Tokyo, and now that's been pushed back with Tokyo. So at least Alfie can, you know, get his head around something that's, you know, quite mentally difficult to take, but he's got that one last shot to, you know, at least make a stand and, you know, really kind of show what he's got, to show what they're losing. So the fact that the basketball guys and girls can't do that is it's pretty harsh, that's for sure, really harsh.
Yeah, and obviously Lee is a former player. I'd imagine that you feel quite strongly about this. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it's just not right, really, because it can't be one rule for one and one rule for other. I mean, my feeling on it is if they were going to change it, you know, anyone who's got an international classification card now, based on what they've got, should have been left alone. Let them finish their careers. You know, put your policy in from now. Anyone who's newly internationally classified, you know, that's the way. I mean, to be honest with you, you can't. What a way to end your sort of careers if you've been doing, you know, 12 years of Paralympics like David Ing, or, you know, the big Turkish guy Cem, you know, just be told, go on. George, his first Paralympic Games, he's a world champion. You know, he's just been crowned a world champion, and he was top scorer, I think, in one of probably the final, was it, or something like that. And all of a sudden now he doesn't get to compete. Yet that guy is internationally classified. He's been allowed to participate for his country. So something's going wrong somewhere if other sports they've been able to strike them deals and wheelchair basketball hasn't. Something definitely needs to be looked at by IWF there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the wheelchair basketball community would reiterate what you're saying there. Now, there's been arguments against the eligibility rulings and arguments for it. One of the arguments that think that the players aren't at a disadvantage is because they can still potentially make a living from the sport. As I don't know if you've seen, but IWBF Europe announced that these non-eligible players that have been deemed non-eligible by the IPC can still compete in Euro Cup, hence still make a living from the sport. And some people would argue that they're not at a disadvantage because of this. What would you say in response to this? Lee, I'll start with you.
I mean, that's credit to them guys, for making that decision. I'd like to see, that supported really, because that is a good thing. And if nothing can be changed for these players to represent the country, at least they've got the sport to still keep living in. However, if you're one of the best players in your sport and you cannot represent your country, that will rip your heart apart. I can guarantee you that right now. Seeing your teammates go and competing when you are good enough and you should be on that platform will destroy them. It won't matter that they've just won a Spanish Cup or a Spanish League or a King's Cup or a Euro Cup. They want to play for their country. There's nothing like putting that vest on, and nothing will ever replace that.
Yeah, definitely. And I would once again say I think the majority of the wheelchair basketball community would agree with you on that. Mike, what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that they would give that up in a heartbeat to play at the Paralympics now, would be my gut feeling. I don't know if that's the case for them, but, making a living and living out your dreams are two very different things. And where it's a good decision, it doesn't make it that any better necessarily, because it's still a tough decision mentally for those guys to get their head around. So yeah, it'd be really interesting if any of the folk who are affected by it would say, if you could choose to play in the Paralympics and not have a career, what would you do? And I don't know. I think I've got no experience of it, but what I've seen and the people that I've met, it's one of those top special moments of your life that you never forget. I'm sure Lee can elaborate on that a bit more.
Yeah, and well, this brings me on to my final question. So, if you had the chance to speak to the head of the IPC face, what would you say to them, and how would you put forward an argument to get them to consider changing their classification code? Mike, I'll ask you this question from a company perspective, and then Lee, I'll ask you this from a former player perspective. But Mike, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, actually, because it's really, really easy to have an opinion. It's really easy to, talk about it very easily without knowing everything involved. So from my perspective, I would want to know the facts. I would want to know a bit more about the vision and what they're trying to create long term and how they got to this point. Before this, I did a little bit of research of what I could find out on that. And there's very little in terms of statements and things like that. There is some information of what they're trying to do, but it's not that clear. So by working back in terms of, what they're trying to do and where they've ended up, I'm pretty sure an outside perspective would then say, well, hold on, that's not really what you're trying to do. You've just kind of gone down a rabbit hole and come out the other side. But actually, have you come out with the right option? And knowing that information, and because it's not right? Everyone knows that. Everyone's thinking it's not right. There's so many other ways of doing this. How did they end up with this one? And I think it maybe just takes somebody with a fresh pair of eyes to almost point that out, and somebody needs to be big enough to say, actually, I think we did get it wrong, and it's not in line with what we originally set out to do.
Yeah, definitely. You make a really interesting case there. Lee, how would you put forward an argument to the IPC as a former player?
I'd probably ask them to sit in a room, and I'd like to bring in these athletes one by one, and I'd like to sort of them listen to basically what their life was like before they got their condition, then what their life was like in the gap in between their condition and finding their sport, wheelchair basketball in this instance, and then what their life was like after sort of competing in that sport and training hard and becoming a potential Paralympic athlete. because it's not a gimme. And this is the thing, you know, on paper, these conditions and these disabilities are just a name. And, you know, them guys don't have the right to sort of deem what's classed as disabled and what's not. You've got to speak to these guys and find out what the struggles that these guys went through. You know, like me, when I was 15, as you mentioned earlier, what was my life like after becoming disabled at the age of 15 to 4 years before I found wheelchair basketball? It was very dull. It was very sitting in a room, sitting at home and not going out. And then you find a sport and then you find a dream of maybe potentially going and representing your country within that sport. It changes your absolute life, and it gives you a focus. And these guys, without them sports and without having that condition, they would have never been able to sort of, you know, rebuild their lives again. So wheelchair basketball and disability sport, you know, they're a rehabilitation, and the fact that they can then still have a career, but more importantly, represent the country. And, you know, I know what it's like with being a GB player. It's probably, you know, they amplify even more to be an Australian sort of athlete. You know, they go crazy. So it's, you know, that would be nothing more for them girls. Nothing more would ever replace than representing the Aussies, you know. So, you know, I think that I'd love them to sort of sit in there and listen to them stories and seeing the struggles, and then sort of say your disability doesn't count.
Yeah, and it's, like you say, it relates a lot to mental health. Like, obviously, when someone suffers an injury, like I was born disabled, so I didn't know it any different. But you acquired disability at 15, and I'd imagine that was quite a dark time for you. But then, obviously, as you mentioned, when you from wheelchair basketball, it's like a new lease of life. And it's the same with me. Even though I didn't acquire a disability, like honestly, I wouldn't know what my life would be like without this sport. So, yeah, so
you're a celebrity now, Dylan. Everyone knows you in this world, mate. And that's, you know, wheelchair basketball probably was the first time you went up there and Cumbria and Ray and all of them. That's just opened this door to being the stardom that we all love.
Yeah, thanks, man. I wouldn't quite say I'm famous, but I'm just a guy that loves what I do. So, you know.
Exactly, and you do it very well, mate.
Yeah, cheers, mate. Cheers. Final thing I'll mention is someone who I'm going to leave unnamed mentioned that they think that a solution to this is that they think the IPC should add a subclause to their code that says any athlete that has a health condition that causes a permanent physical impairment should be able to prove how the health condition leads to their permanent physical impairment, and it's on the athlete to prove how they should be eligible to play in disability sport. Would you agree with this subclause to be added? Like, what's your opinion on it, Mike? I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think anything that helps, right? You know, there's a lot of subjectivity in that, but at the same time, it does give an athlete to appeal and have that right to put their case forward, which I don't know if that's happened throughout that process. So I think just having an extra level there is always going to help. Does it solve all the issues? Probably not, but it's a step closer, probably.
Yeah, and Lee, how would you feel about this subclause?
Just the same what Mike said. Anything that'll help. You know, anywhere the door that opens these guys to be back in. You know, you look at it in probably the benefit situation where people might be have to be reviewed after 2 or 3 years in case their condition has improved and then they're not eligible. Something like that, you know, just review, just make sure that, you know, they're still qualified. But anything that helps to, you know, get these guys back in the door, definitely.
Well, and that's all my questions for today. But once again, guys, thank you very much for doing this. Is there any final thoughts that you'd like to add?
Just from me, hopefully IWBF and IPC can sort of come with a thingy, and good luck to the guys. You know, keep a bit of a message to all of them affected. Just keep fighting down, and hopefully, you know, we're all behind you. Us all here, RGK behind you, and the whole wheelchair basketball community are behind you. Good luck.
Yeah, and Mike, any final words from you?
Yeah, very similar thing, really. It's just, you know, all these athletes and teammates have been affected. It's, you know, keep going, keep believing it, keep going. And, there's a lot of movement behind this. A lot of people have got strong opinions and good reasons and good opinions. So it's all about just working together and trying to get what's right, and hopefully we create something better at the end of it.
All right, that sounds great. And then would you like to plug anything, any social media, any products or anything?
No, I think Lee's done that with his background. We're all good.
No UK WB plug, Lee.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, to the end of the day, that's what I've tried to do with the all-inclusive with UKWB, and, hopefully that'll keep on growing from strength to strength and just giving people an opportunity to play wheelchair basketball. That's all it's about.
Yeah, shout out Ray McBride as well for helping out with that. Legend. All right, guys, so, I'm just going to conclude this interview now, but once again, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, Dylan. Cheers, mate.
Dylan, mate.